Good afternoon. This is Wanda McKnight with the McKnight Report. Thank you for joining us. We're here tonight with Professor Lorenzo Morris at Howard University. Professor Morris is an expert in electoral politics and black politics. Professor, good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you.
Professor, can you first of all explain those terms to us? What is electoral politics?
Well, electoral politics just simply deals with the behaviors associated with voting in elections, campaigning, organizing, interest groups related to elections, and anything that involves individuals acting either in elections themselves or in group forms related to elections. So it goes from the idea of persuading people to get involved, to motivating people to turn out, and turnout is a big issue with electoral politics, to the funding of campaigns and the processes that are involved in everything leading up to the assumption of office, which also includes party organizing.
I see. Now, would you define the term black politics?
Well, black politics used to include only electoral politics, only as a small part, because most of black politics was built around community organizing, around religious groups, or around mass movements, dating back to the study of things like the Garvey movement, to the Million Man March, and all the stuff in between, to, of course, the Civil Rights Movement. So black politics includes electoral politics as it applies to African Americans. But it has a special focus because the role of electoral politics in African American experience has been different than that of electoral politics in the larger American political experience.
We've recently had an election, and now could you give us your take on that? Some people say that this election was supposed to have been a referendum on President Barack Obama.
What a lot of people say actually is significant, more significant than the facts themselves in some cases. I think this is one of the first elections in which I think there should be a measurable self-determining prophecy. Self-determining prophecy. The media said repeatedly that the turnout was going to make such a huge difference for the Republicans, and that Barack Obama would be sunk by high turnout. And when I looked at the record in midterm elections, that is elections between the first coming of a president and the re-election effort that might follow, it always projects an increase in Republican turnout, but no election did the media ever project or show an increase as large as the one projected in this election. In fact, going up to this election, Democrats, in terms of respondents, were ahead of Republicans, but the media just assumed they wouldn't turn out much. And one of the reasons was that many of the voters for Obama, the young and the African American voters and the Hispanic voters, didn't have stable voting patterns. That is reasonable, but the level of difference projected was so high as in my opinion, that it may have well affected expectations, because we do know from polling that people don't like to be on the losing side. If they think that their candidate is not a winner, they are discouraged. People don't struggle against the waves or against the odds or against the forces of what they think is a mass tendency. They rather go with the flow. Everybody likes to be a winner in this country, if not most countries.
Professor, are you telling us that the fact that the polls say this or that could actually influence the election results?
Certainly, I think it could and probably did, but I can't measure the amount. That's why I think it is measurable, but it hasn't been measured yet. But there's also the other part that in any midterm election, seating presidents normally, if their party is also in control, lose votes. And the Democrats were in such large numbers, they were much more vulnerable to losing. Secondly, there was an actual movement. Movements are rare in white American society, frankly, real movements, and there was a Tea Party movement. But it was a fairly disorganized movement by comparison with most. But movements on the other side, a large numerical vulnerability of people standing for election who were Democrats, made them weaker. Still, one of the things that is kind of ironic and that the media didn't talk about is if you look at the last 5 presidents, Carter, Reagan, Daddy Bush, Clinton, Baby Bush. Only 2 of them had favorable ratings in public opinion at the midterm. You know which 2 they were?
Which 2?
Oh, you weren't supposed to ask. That was a rhetorical question. Carter and George Bush Sr. What do they have in common?
That they did not?
They both lost the next election. The one who had the worst reviews from the general electorate after the 2 years of his first term was Reagan. And he is nearly deified by the same people. in all probability, if the pattern holds, the term referendum on Obama will be shown to be insignificant, even if true, because these people who don't do well in the first cycle of their election period tend to be reelected. Clinton was reelected. Reagan was obviously reelected. So that is not the issue, but it does impact the Obama administration and is something of a judgment, not because they didn't do well or not because the Democrats didn't do well, since the dominant party normally loses anyway, but because it reflected in the way the media could present the issues and the way the Tea Party could present the issues. It reflected on the ability of the Obama administration and its allies to present a coordinated front, to mobilize the people they were thought to be able to mobilize. But to my mind, it was not the kind of thing that could be called a referendum, since it simply exposed some of the weaknesses of Democratic organizing and of Obama administration organizing. That exposition of weakness may make them better prepared in the 2012 elections, but more importantly, it may leave open the possibility that those who won are really, really very weak themselves.
Professor, explain what you mean by the fact that you said that the Tea Party is a disorganized
The Tea Party, first of all, claimed to be grassroots. But the majority of the people in the Tea Party had higher incomes than the regular voters. The Tea Party claimed to be coordinated in a national way, but yet it had, not only did it have no single leader, but where coordination occurred, it wasn't very successful. While she supported many people, the people that Sarah Palin was best known for supporting lost. The touch of Sarah Palin was not the Midas touch, unless you mean freezing somebody. But O'Donnell lost in Delaware. Well, I rather regret that. Not that she wouldn't have been anything but a horror, but her ineptitude would have certainly exposed the lack of intellectual and ideological clarity among that group. But then others lost as well. What's his name? I repressed his name. The guy in Washington State running against Patty Murray lost. Certainly Joe Miller is losing or will have lost. He certainly was a failure in Alaska, and this was against a stable Republican. The point here is that among those who are even moderately moderate, the Tea Party, in conflict with them, the Tea Party didn't do that well. And where they did well is where the opposition was just generally disorganized. So the question is, what does the Tea Party do? And how does that relate to Obama, since we're talking about black politics? Does it relate at all? Everybody is falling head over heels denying it's not about race. First of all, race is not irrelevant, since race is one of the agenda items. And how can I say it's not irrelevant? Among the top 5 issues which Tea Party respondents in a recent major poll, I believe it was Pew Research pointed out, was issues of race in the Obama administration that Tea Party people, it was the bottom of the 5. But if among the top 5, something like 11% say that's a major issue, you can imagine what they really think. They aren't, you know, and so I've begun to wonder how this happens. You see, even though they're better off than many, they are still disorganized, and they mobilize the votes of people who are not better off, poor whites. So I remember seeing another poll that asked people with a popular phrase, "We want our country back." Now, I don't know about you, but everybody knows that there's some ambiguity at best in "we want our country back." Most people, they want it back from whom? And so some people have said that means race, and that's a problem. I don't think that has to be the case. They don't have to mean want it back from the black man in the White House. The problem that is racial is the we. It is the assumption that there's a shared sentiment of belief. And this we is so undefinable as to extend infinitely, but that lack of specificity is belied by the fact that everybody says it. They all seem to know who the we is. And that is what is more threatening than the they from whom they want the country back. But anyway, I always say they can't have it. But then when they interview the we on the street, and you know, I remember this one TV thing. This person was, I don't remember exactly where they were, but they said, "Who are the we?" And they said, "Well, people like us, you know, the middle class." And you look at this person is sitting in a trailer park. You know, Americans tend to think that they are the dominant believers anyway, and so they all see themselves as exposed. You know, and when you look at the we that is being vulnerable, they see themselves as part of the dominant group. Now, the dominant group, how and what? if it isn't racial, it is so ambiguous that one cannot preclude race. But more importantly, there's an assumption of differentiation that goes along with race. So it is a substratum of that kind of prejudicial distinction without a factual base that feeds the discriminatory and racially hostile attitudes that have so long characterized this country. So I don't exclude race. On the contrary, I think that race is linked to it, even if it doesn't define itself explicitly as racial.
Well, then what are we to make of the Tea Party? Is it significant?
Oh, I think it's significant for the short run. I mean, it's hard to imagine, even in a country that has never shown a disdain for people who are not particularly intellectual in leadership, a la George Bush, that such ineptitude can last. For example, by April, or I think it's April or May, certainly in the spring, they will face a vote on extending the debt in the Republican Party, or going into default. And the Tea Party says they won't vote for any debt increases. You know, you get these kinds of things. They don't want to spend any, they don't want to raise taxes even from the super rich. Now, I'm sure that many of your friends may be casually making over $250,000 in taxable income. They know $250,000 in taxable income means you actually make over $300,000 a year. So these people, these poor people, they don't want to take their money from. And they don't want to, so the idea of saving has never been meaningfully established in a way that goes along with tax income. They want to save government expenditures, but they don't want to cut out anything you can name except discretionary income, which we all know by now is a very small amount of federal expenditures. But forget the technicality. It seems to me that somebody in any organization ought to be demanding an administrative capability from its leaders. And the fact that they can get so far without it makes me think that they don't even have long-range views and perspectives. They don't expect to do anything for that long. For example, one of the things that characterizes them is that they were virtually all 90+% either officially Republicans or active Republicans. Or when they were interviewed and they said they were independents and they were, how did they last vote? It was as Republicans. So it had a partisan basis. But what had happened was the party had lost a lot of its appeal. And you see that in today's data. Those people under 29 still voted overwhelmingly Republican. It's just that they didn't turn out, which reflects some of the weaknesses of the Democratic Party. And I think of the Obama administration as well. And one of the big weaknesses was that none of them wanted to insist on what I call a progressive agenda, and all of them wanted to bend over backwards, denying race. So far back that the blacks had less motivation to go out and before. The only thing that inspired the Hispanics, and in some cases the blacks, to save them where they needed to be saved was that those issues were inescapable. Bless her heart, Sharon Angle brought anti-Hispanic feeling up in Nevada and mobilized the Hispanics to huge numbers. And so you have states like Nevada, which have significant Hispanic populations that saved the Democrats, and small but significant black populations. 7% of Nevada is black. But apparently they turned out much larger where it counted. And it saved Harry Reid, who as a symbol of the Democrats in the Senate was important to me. At another point, I might say that one of the things that isn't known about Harry Reid, and certainly was not something to brag about before the campaign, is that he's done a lot within the Senate to push for black participation among the staff, among students. He's a wonderful person when it comes to reaching out to students in higher education, and you know, but people like me couldn't jump up and say I'm for Harry Reid because that would turn off other people. But I think that that kind of positive sentiment facing a kind of hostile negative sentiment helped to generate a consciousness among Democrats in Nevada to mobilize and respond to their minority constituencies. So that on the one hand, you need to be conscious of the racial issues where they are there, and along with that, something that hasn't happened in this administration and that may be linked to is the running away from anything on the left, running away from the things that black people are most likely to be mobilized around.
So do you think it's possible that the Tea Party will actually fail of its own initiative?
I think it's impossible they could do anything else. But what the damage they do while failing is that all they have to do is revert back to type. That sounds like a trouble. Just the regular Republicans that they are. The difference is that this middle class group has been able to mobilize some lower class population in terms of lower income population. But if you look at overall statistics, if blacks and Hispanics and white progressive had turned out at the levels that they did in 2008, they wouldn't have done that well at all. So that their continued viability isn't linked to organizational integrity because they haven't really organized stably outside of the Republican Party. And now that the Republican Party is in power, they tend to focus. One of the things that happens with any movement, and it isn't often that well noticed, even for black movements, is that once anybody wins strongly, the movements that are associated with them are weakened because everything focuses on the institutional structures. So to the extent they melt into the Republican leadership, they will not only be exposed to pressures to make decisions, but their whole organizational structure will be weakened. Now, how can I say that with an additional degree of reassurance? One is a lot of the money came from that huge corporate influx. This is the first election where there wasn't a tidal wave of Republicans, in my view, as the biggest issue. It was a tidal wave of corporate money hidden going into this election like never before in history. And it hasn't been calculated where this hidden money came from or where it went. But we know that some of it went to Tea Party people. But that corporate money can't subsidize the Tea Party attitude for too long, because the Tea Party attitude will even hurt them in the long run, since they don't want to pay the debt. They don't want to deal with the things that go with it.
Well, do you think that the Republican Party will continue to be the party of no?
No, I think you'll send them the party of whatever. Let me come back to that, whatever. But that they will have to absorb some of the Tea Party people. Let's take someone like Rand Paul. I mean, he's gotten over shouting that the Civil Rights Act needs to be retracted, mainly because it's just not a good thing. But now he's passed on the Social Security and Medicaid and Medicare. Apparently he wants people, if they get sick and old, to just go somewhere else and deal with it. So these things are going to disrupt the agenda. What does that mean? What is the parallel? In 1994, we had a more coherent tidal wave, if you want to call it, of Republicans coming into office under Newt Gingrich with his contract on America. I call it the contract on America. Technically, they call it the contract with America, but that's just, they had poor use of prepositions. Anyway, in the contract with America, they arrived, and what did they do immediately? Nothing. They threatened, they held up the federal budget. They thought they'd make Clinton look bad, and you know what McConnell said? His whole goal in life from now is to make Obama look bad. Now, how many people, that's your goal? You're the head of the Senate, but your goal is to make somebody look bad? Well, first of all, he looks bad just looking at him in some ways, but that aside, Gingrich was better organized than this crew. And he didn't have that many unvetted people arriving with him. Some people, the French have this phrase, they call it free electrons. These off-the-wall people with him. And all they could do was hold up Clinton's agenda. They thought it would make it. Remember the budget freeze, and you couldn't get any budget passed. Americans turned against them and voted Clinton back into office. They tried the normal thing that happens when you come in with a big tidal wave and you don't have anything to do: scandal. I think the Obama leadership is perfect in many ways on a personal level, but I'm sure one of the interns in the office stepped on somebody's toe or something. They'll be looking for scandal. They already promised that. They'll be looking for scandal because you don't have an agenda. The point here is, in the normal course of events, as they have described them, they parallel that of 1994, except that they are less well organized, which means that they're likely to have very little legislative product, so that the electorate is likely to be resentful. And they expect that to turn against the president. Historically, it hasn't worked that well. And then secondly, that by their own admission, they're concerned about exposing weaknesses in the current administration. Exposés rarely last as long as the McCarthyites, but you need a coherent ideological community with the rest of the nation, and they don't have that. Most of the people who respond to issue surveys don't agree with them on most of the issues, even on health care. So they don't have this rah-rah community behind them that they pretend they do.
No mandate.
Yeah, yes.
Well, then what should the Democrats do to rejuvenate that enthusiasm that they had when the president was elected?
Here's where my opinion differs from those of others. Most people think he should try to build a greater community with the opposing party. I think that's wasting his time. I think he should be open and let other Democrats do that in the Senate and in the House. I rather like Nancy Pelosi, and I think it's incredible that the attack on her is based simply on the fact that she was a better organizer than everybody else, and the Republicans hated her because she did so well. It's just that they couldn't get the Senate to follow through, and they couldn't get a strong starting point from Obama. On health care, it would have been better, in my view, to go down fighting on the public option to show your to mobilize your constituency. What he needs to do is to get his constituency that got him there out to the polls. And one way is a little bit of ideological clarity without being ideologically obsessive. There is a left. People say return to the center. I say the best way to return to the ideological center is to make the center move. They moved it right. You need to make the center move left. You can't control the center or return to it if you keep following it as it moves to the right. And you know, I think his civil, almost gentlemanly-like approach to a party that was not open to an agenda at all made it very weak. And then it was followed by the one thing that black Americans on the left, and I think white Americans on the left as well, I should say both, failed to realize. He still learned his politics in Chicago. That's not corrupt or anything. It just means that's the compromise kind of environment. He needs to take more rather than less of the Martin Luther King influence, which, while it was open to reason, was also committed to a strong direction. And that kind of thing we don't talk about. Everybody says he's the fruition of Martin Luther King's dream. He could be, but he hasn't been so far, and that's not a negative. It means simply that a clear consciousness. Remember King's last thing was about equity and fairness for the poor and how justice was so linked to them. That's not radical communist socialism, as they say, and it certainly isn't Islamic or unique. It is a universally acceptable progressive message, which even if you don't agree should be recognized as acceptable and progressive. And so if we could just take up what King affirmed in 1968 and before then as a reasonable national agenda, then I think you will get some of the left mobilized.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you for joining us. You've been with the McKnight Report, information you really want. Thank you, and stay tuned for our next episode.